Welcome back, everyone. The first generation iPad was one of the most intriguing devices that Apple has ever made, and although I probably wouldn't recommend buying it anymore to use, it's actually still impressive how great of a feeling device Apple made at this moment. Now here's the thing, Apple has made some questionable iPhone designs every once in a while, like the first generation iPhone, the 3G, 3GS. They may not feel like the most premium devices anymore, but they probably felt really premium at that time. Now some exceptions, the iPhone 5C, and there have been some other products Apple's made throughout their life where they don't feel like the most premium thing ever, but I have never even thought of or even felt a cheap iPad before. Every single iPad Apple has ever made has felt extremely premium, and this is no exception. The first generation iPad, which came out almost 12 years ago as of this point, is crazy because of how premium this thing still feels for how old of a device this is. Now, like I mentioned, this thing came out in 2010, so this thing is pushing 12 years old right now, which is crazy. Now, on the front of this device, we do have that 9.7-inch panel, and it's interesting because pretty much every single iPad Apple's made, for the most part, a lot of them had 9.7-inch panels. Now the base iPads have gone up to 10.2 inches, but this is still a pretty good panel. We have quite a bit of bezel around it. It's definitely not like a bezel-less king or anything like that. But here's the thing about this iPad. In my opinion, the fact that this thing had this big, beautiful panel at that time, and it still is pretty much in the same design as the newer iPads, the base models, it's actually really impressive. And when I look at the iPad first generation, and I look at, the iPad Pros, the M1 iPad Pros, there is still a lot of overlap, which is really, really interesting. When I look at the first iPhone and I look at the latest iPhone, there are definitely a lot of differences, but with these iPads design-wise, they are still very premium, and with the flat sides and everything, it's kind of interesting. Now, we do have that original 30-pin connector on the bottom, which is very, very funny to look at nowadays. We had a headphone jack on this thing too, and just kind of hitting on the premiumness of this thing. When I feel this thing in the hand, it feels almost like a MacBook. How premium feeling MacBooks feel nowadays? This thing feels along the same lines of it, has a really good heft to it, and I'm a humongous fan of this iPad for sure. Now on the back, straight aluminum back as well. No cameras on this thing. That didn't come until the next generation iPad, which I think was one of the biggest differences ever, but this specific iPad had that standard build quality. It still feels really good, had a really nice heft to it, and with these tablets being, almost 12 years old at this point, it's crazy because if you had to feel it, it wouldn't feel like a 12-year-old tablet, it wouldn't feel like a 12-year-old, iPad. It would feel like, iPad from like a couple years ago or something. I think that's the best way to put it. So in terms of that, the body, extremely premium. There's no wireless charging, no IP certification, no nothing like that. Very basic in terms of what it can do. But at that moment, Apple had a really big plan ahead of it. And here's the thing, back when this iPad first came out, and most of you probably remember this, every single person who pretty much looked at this iPad stated, why would I buy an iPad? I already have an iPhone. iPads are just bigger iPhones. It just doesn't really make too much sense to buy it. And I kind of heard that same kind of narrative being said probably for the next couple of years, to be honest. Even when the iPad, third generation, fourth, fifth, all those other iPads came out, people were still saying the same thing. And I kind of have a lot of respect for Apple to continue to keep, making these iPads, even though a lot of people were stating that. And maybe the sales numbers at first weren't amazing, but right now, people buy iPads all of the time. There's people who don't even have any other Apple products. They may have an Android as their main device, or they may be using a Windows, PC, but they still own an iPad because there's just so much functionality behind it. And I agree with that. One of the biggest things I've seen a lot of people purchase iPads for recently is for iOS and iPad OS development. Before, you could really use an iPhone if you wanted to go ahead and actually, utilize and build iPad apps as well. But since Apple kind of split iOS and iPadOS, this kind of made a little bit of a different, type of ecosystem for iPads. So now there's a lot of, developers who buy iPads just for iPadOS development, which is really impressive. And that's just one use case. There are so many people who buy iPads for gaming, for so many different things. And this iPad originated that, system, which is crazy to me. Now, this iPad itself didn't have the most amount of features. It didn't really last a crazy amount of time. As far as I know from what I'm reading, it started off with iOS 4. It did get all the way up to iOS 5.1.1, which I don't know if that's true or not, but my specific model I am around on iOS 5. And when I maneuver through the UI, I am still kind of shocked by how similar this UI is to, iOS 15, but we'll get into that guess, a different year. But I do think when I hold this iPad and I maneuver through it, it isn't a bad feeling iPad. It still feels very premium. It still performs pretty decent, which I'll get into in a second too. But I think in terms of the features and everything that are built into this iPad, obviously there's not a lot of things you can do with it anymore. But at that time back in 2010, I'm sure this was all the rave, and I'm sure people picked up this iPad because of just the amount of features, and because this thing had the App Store in it too. I mean, you could download a bunch of applications for it. So when it comes down to that, huge thumbs up in my standpoint as well. Now, performance wise, this thing did have that Apple A4 chip inside of it, which isn't the fastest thing at this time, but back in 2010, it was one of the newest chipsets that Apple made at that time. So a lot of respect for Apple there, but it also only had 256 megabytes of RAM. Now, that is not that much RAM nowadays. I mean, a single application can hold way more RAM than that. Our iPhone 13s have 4 gigs, our iPhone 13 Pros have, 6 gigs, and I think the M1 iPad Pros go up to 12 or 16 gigs now too. So this RAM pretty much isn't that great anymore, but the thing to keep in mind with these iPads is that back then, this was probably, the 16 gigs of RAM option that we have nowadays, mostly because those applications weren't utilizing all those resources, and they were basic apps. There wasn't really anything crazy you could do at that moment. There may be some cool things here and there, but for the most part, it was pretty basic. With this specific iPad though, I mean, you had a lot of capability at that moment, but right now, a lot of things you can't really do with it. The biggest complaints I have with this iPad is that you can't really download applications on it anymore. And that's kind of the biggest disadvantage. You can't go to the App Store and download any app you want. There are still some apps that you can download. I think like Temple Run I was able to get, but for the most part, you can't really download what you want. And that is kind of a disadvantage, When you go and pick up a device like this, I mean, most people are going to buy it for a collector's item, but I would not recommend buying this iPad if you think you can still use it. But for what it was at that time, and for it still being able to turn on and still kind of have some, capability here and there, I'm actually somewhat impressed by the capability behind this iPad. I obviously wouldn't recommend it, but even when I look back at old reviews of the iPad first generation that other people have made, it's really impressive what some people were saying at that moment and how some of them actually predicted the future. There were some who said, the iPad is a novelty, it's just a fad, but some other people kind of saw some things coming, and there were some articles about it too, which is really crazy. So in terms of performance and everything, that pretty much covers it up there. And ultimately, I mean, the first generation iPad is still a beast. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend using it anymore. It's completely outdated with software. We are like 10 versions of iOS on top of this one. But when I think of this iPad first generation and I see what it brought to the table, I'm actually really impressed what Apple was able to do at that moment and how they kept, pushing out these newer generation iPads year after year after year. And they were able to make the iPad a massive success, especially now in 2022. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.